We are going to resume our board meeting. If I can have a motion to resume?
So moved.
Second? Oh. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, moving on to agenda item number 9, discussion on board member selection. Okay.
Yes, I had this put on the agenda because I have some concern that we're not following some of the guidelines that was recommended by the city. And so I'll just read the letter that I wrote to Chair Galloway and Vice Chair Fine because it's pretty self-explanatory. Chair Galloway and Co-Chair Fine, I am writing to address Director Harness interviewing prospective new board members and the letter from Stephanie M. Yarrow sent to the board on Tuesday, February the 12th, 2019. After our last list of applicants we received from Mr. Moya, I was surprised that Director Harness decided to interview the prospective new board members. It seems that Stephanie M. Yarrow's email message on 2/12/19 at 2:55 p.m. sent to the board describes the city council appointment process to the POB. For your convenience, I have attached a complete copy of this email message. The final paragraph of this message states, Also, it was my understanding that the purpose of providing the nominees to the CPOA prior to their appointment was so that POB members could help them understand the nature of their commitment and help start building their capacity to serve as part of the efforts to cut down on the turnover. However, I did not expect that they would be interviewed by the seat of the CPOA. Please let me know if you need need to discuss this further in order to clarify. In any event, if you or any of the POB members have feedback on whether anyone doesn't seem up to the task with respect to the workload and commitment, we would welcome that discussion. I agree with Mrs. Yarrow's comment on Director Harness interviewing the prospective POB board members. Since he is CPOA staff, he should not be part of the process of selecting the POB members, nor should any recommendations given by him be included in the selection process. This process described by Mrs. Yarrow in her email message 2/12/19 at 2:55 p.m. to Director Harness involves the City Council, the staff they have chosen to assist them, and the Police Oversight Board. Any concerns from the board can be addressed to Mrs. Yarrow as she recommended in her letter. Director Harness is welcome to attend the outreach meeting with prospective new board members and meet them at this time. This exercise has taken the City Council and their staff time in assisting in our board and thorough undertaking adapting to better process. Also, this email message from Mrs. Yarrow addresses why we are provided the nominees' information prior to their appointment. The process she describes allows current POB members to help potential appointees understand the nature of their comment. Respectfully submitted, Valerie St. John.
Do we need any kind of action on that, or is that, I mean, it's clear that the appropriate time, obviously the executive director wants to meet, and other staff members have come to the orientation sessions that we put on, but I think Ms. Yarrow's been clear about their expectation about separate interviews by the executive director being not part of the process they signed up for. So I think we just wanted to be clear about this, and I don't know if it requires any vote on our part, but I think Ms. St. John just wanted it in the record.
I guess my question would be, Director Harness, I can only speak to the experience that I had with you prior to joining the board, and I didn't receive that meeting with you as being an interview to the board. It was more of a getting to know you, answer any questions that you may have, facilitate any information sharing that you had prior to my joining. Was it different, I guess? Well, I'm going to go with the two of you because you're the most recent.
I feel exactly the same way. I did not feel like the meeting that I had with Director Harness in the beginning was an interview. he didn't like ask me about my background or anything that felt like an assessment. It felt like an introduction to me. So I don't know what others have experienced, but I agree.
No, go ahead. I want to hear what you have to say, and then I'm going to get
I
to
would
Chelsea.
confer with Member Armijo Pruitt that it didn't appear to me to be an interview, and I think some of the conversation we had, indicated that we were sort of both on the same page and kind of not knowing, when City Council was going to act on proposed appointments and how those would move, how quickly those would move, and mostly it was a process of letting me know, what kinds of training I would need to do, what kinds of expectations there were of the board, what kind of time commitments, basically just how to hit the ground running is sort of how I saw that. I didn't
How
feel
would you
just-
say it differed from the orientation that we did? Is it same content?
I felt that it was, there was some overlap in the content, but at the same time, he was able to answer some questions that I think we both had about the agency, met some of the investigators, kind of got a clearer picture of what happens in the agency, which we ultimately oversee. So I thought it was a good perspective, but
Chelsea?
Yeah, I think that, I don't think this is very timely, but I would say that I remember receiving that email from Ms. Yada, and my impression of it at the time was that she had just misinterpreted what Director Harness described as a meeting he had with a potential appointee. I mean, I don't remember what document it's in, whether it's in the ordinance or the CASA, but there is a meeting that occurs with the CPOA and new board members, and that's just a part of onboarding people, explaining the history of the CPOA, filling in gaps in knowledge. I don't think Director Harness has ever, done some sort of interview screening, whatever. My appointment with Director Harness was to answer any questions I had about the formation of the CPOA, institutional history, things like that. So I don't really think there's anything to address here, really at all.
Well, I totally disagree with this, and I base this by saying because Director Harness also made his comments to City Council, and he also CC'd his comments to Elizabeth Martinez. Yes, she was also included in his opinions, and I think this is more of a board issue. This is our thing, and the ordinance even says that the City Council appoints. Mrs. Yarrow, I think you have to remember, she is the Director of Council Services. She's the one that doesn't want him interviewing, because the CPOA.
But he's not interviewing people.
Well,
He's doing just an introductory
Well, then
information
I think
session.
what he can do is he can do it with the rest of us when we have our meeting, our outreach meeting. We had 3 meetings with Mr. Moya here to get the city council and for his office to agree for us to be even active in the process. And our agreement was with him was to have the board members, like we did, come to outreach meeting and ask questions. And so I think we need to stick with what we agreed to do.
Yes. Ms. Fine?
I think that the experience of the people who ended up on the board is maybe different than the experience of the people who did not end up on the board who were suggested by the city council. So it's great that, that it worked out for the people that are here. But there were people that were interviewed, visited with, who were found wanting, and that conversation was had with other people. And so that is a process that I think is safer if we just do it together, and, staff comes, whoever comes, we do it together.
Mr. Moya, the communications that you've had with Director Harness regarding the potential board members, do you all, I assume that you take the response, the observations of the director into consideration, and I assume you would with us as well. But was that the factor in asking the board members who had been selected not to serve, or changing course?
Madam Chair, The only communications I made with Director Harness with those appointments was when he asked me for their contact information and their applications, and that was it.
So it doesn't feel to council services as though the selection of board members the Director Harness's communications are part of that selection process? Do you guys feel firmly footed and you all are the ones who have chosen, per the ordinance, who serves on this board? Per the
Madam
council.
Chair, I can only speak for myself as council staff, and I'd agree with that, but I can't speak for other council staff or city councilors individually.
Okay, so for you, do you feel confident that you all made the decisions?
Madam Chair, yes.
I kind of feel a little bit like it raises a good point, and perhaps there is some merit to Director Harness not having communications with prospective board members outside of subcommittee level and bringing them in and having those processes that we're in the process of developing, I guess, and trying that out. This was the first go-round, but it kind of feels a little bit like chasing ghosts to me. Dr. Cass and then member.
I guess I'm curious as to how this concerns us as a board. It seems to me this is an issue that's between the council staff and Director Harness. And if there's and I don't see how there's any implication that there's been anything negative about having communication with board members, prospective board members, given that that's the purpose of being the executive director, is to ultimately inform board members about their responsibilities and create some kind of a relationship. But I just don't see how this is an issue that has anything to do with this board. And so I guess I'd like to know if Member St. John wants to put this as a motion to take action or not, or I think that there's nothing we should, I don't think we should do anything. I don't.
Well, I would agree with that, but I would also add that I think we're skipping past the part that there is a requirement that Director Harness meet with board members.
Do you have that up?
I don't remember what exact document it's in, but I'm sure I could find it if I, was given some time. But I mean, he's not doing anything wrong. He's doing what is required of him given our governing authorities.
Well, that would be
So
contradicted by her letter, so that's
Yes.
confusing. So we should clarify that.
Well, and that letter is 6 months old. It may have been, I think you suggested that it was confusion,
I think there was when I read that letter at the time, I thought that there was miscommunication happening, not that there was someone that we were out of line in any way.
Director Harness.
Chair Galloway, I'm surprised that the board would want to exclude me from speaking with prospective board members.
Sorry.
Within the confines and within the concept of the fact that I am the executive director of the administrative office and you're the board, and we have separate functions. And those functions are, I would say, I'd venture to say, the functions of the agency are much better described by me than the board. The city council is the one that ultimately decides who's on the board and who isn't on the board. Now, in one case, through having a discussion, it's not an interview, what's your background? What made you interested in this? What are you doing now? Do you have the time to do this? Yes, I came across a problem that would violate the ordinance for somebody to be on the board, so I pointed it out. Should I have just let that go? That would be derelict in my duties, I believe. So for this to be categorized as an interview, I think is not the proper context for the conversations that I have with prospective board members. sit down, let's talk, here's who we are, this is where we operate, here's our investigators. It's one-on-one, it's not the whole agency grilling somebody. It's not that. And quite frankly, I think because Ms. Yara may have misconstrued something, if the board wants to take a vote and say, I can't meet with prospective board members, then take the vote, then that's fine.
And
That's
just
not what we said.
just one second.
I have a
I'm
proposal.
sorry, give me just
Okay.
1 second.
All right.
I would say that there was nothing about my experience with you or anything that I've seen from you since that would make me uncomfortable with you meeting one-on-one with somebody. I sat in with these two and a couple of other prospective board members for our onboarding process, and I will say that I felt like we did most of the talking. And so a one-on-one with Director Harness was probably more beneficial to allow you guys to feel the freedom to ask the questions that you may not have had the opportunity to, probably some time away from the big conversation to kind of reflect on the information you had heard and then be able to formulate questions. I think that there's some value in that. And I don't think, to Vice Chair Fine's point, I don't think that anybody's asking to exclude you. It's a matter of what is the appropriate venue for you to have those conversations, but.
I have a proposal, and I propose that you meet with the outreach committee, because like they said, there was probably some things that were repetitive. That way no one's really, because time is valuable. So I think we should, like I said in my letter, let's meet with the group and have a discussion with our new board members. And I think that would solve this situation.
Is that a motion?
I think that happens anyway. And
Well,
so
no.
it's just that
Well,
second
he's
step
meeting-
of,
Let's put it on the agenda for the outreach meeting.
and do you
Okay.
want to, I think that the question that we need to answer is, do you want to make a motion that says Director Harness cannot meet with prospective board
That's not what
members
we said.
on his own?
That's
No,
not-
I know, but do you want to do that? And Valerie?
Well, I think that we need to be clear. Is there something in there that says it's supposed to happen? And if it's supposed to happen, then why did we invent this whole orientation thing for the board? And if it's not supposed to happen, then we need to know that. There's a
And
there's a
And
conflict of
the
information.
orientation thing, oh, I'm sorry.
So I just wanted to relay that in joining this board, there is so much to learn, right? And I have not got my hands around it or my head around it at all. I found my meeting with Director Harness to be very useful, and I found my meeting with Outreach to be very useful. Director Harness, the first time we met with Outreach, was there as well. But it was a different experience. And frankly, in getting my bearings about what this board was going to be like, I appreciated having multiple meetings.
Okay.
I did. And so, and I didn't feel in my meeting like there was anything scrutinizing. It was very much an introduction, and just being able to have a conversation about what is the mission and what is expected. And there wasn't so much overlap between the discussions that made either one, they weren't redundant. And what redundancy there was probably needed, because there's so much to learn, so.
And board members will have a very different perspective of joining the board than Director Harness can provide on his own. So I do think that both are useful.
Okay,
So how should we address Mrs. Yara's letter and
let's
concerning?
call her.
I think I'll just call her.
It's
I
6
think
months
before-
old.
I think before this can proceed any further, we need to have a motion on the floor.
There was no
There was
motion.
not
There
a
was no
motion on
motion,
this.
and there may not be need for one.
And if there is no motion on the floor, then I suggest we move on.
Okay.
Well, I'll just, yeah, we'll just move on.
Unless, Tina, did you find anything that kind of, just to kind of put a pin in that one?
Chair Galloway, I have not found anything in the CASA or the ordinance that specifically requires a meeting prior to the appointment of a board member with the executive director. There are numerous requirements once a board member has been appointed regarding trainings and orientations with both the executive director as well as legal counsel.
But I want to remind you one more time, we invited ourselves to be part of this process because the ordinance said it's the city council that picks. We worked diligently, us three, with Mr. Moya, with through 3 meetings to find out what our role would be in selection. Until those meetings, we basically had none. We agreed with him that we would sit down, just us, and Director Harness would be there too, because if he comes to our meetings, and we would all work together on these new board members. And that is our agreement, and I will stick to the agreement that I have with Mr. Moya as what our part was supposed to be.
Okay. Okay, so moving on. Board member removal process. I believe this is yours? Is it- Oh, Dr. Cass, that's right.
So, as a way of introduction, I wrote a letter to the board through Director Harness in July 22nd, I think it was, where I suggested that because of the recent activity associated with, requests, demands, with us requesting us to remove board members, I think that we need to address this issue on a general basis and not a reactive basis, in that we should decide what it is that constitutes a removal process, and before we start applying it to recent situations. So what I'm suggesting in this, and I didn't, I think you've all had a chance to see this, but I didn't bring a copy for tonight. I mean, I have a copy myself. But what I did at the time was to go through and think of various aspects that, reasons for board member removal, what the process would be. And I think it becomes a very complicated, involved process that has to follow a procedure that's developed in the, in the cold light of day, where no one in particular is being considered for removal. I think we need to have a process in place first. And so what I'm suggesting essentially is that we either handle this with some mechanism, either an ad hoc committee for that purpose, which I think was along the lines of what Chair Galloway was suggesting last month that we do for social media policy, or we assign it to one of the existing subcommittees for consideration and development, and then create a process, or at least investigate what's necessary to create a process, look at other best practices and other organizations that have this, and then come back to the board with report back to the board with the progress on developing that process. And so I think if we have a constraint with respect to having too many subcommittees, or serving on too many subcommittees, one way to address this might be to assign it to, say, the Personnel Committee, start with that. And I don't know if we need to, we could augment that, we could have, there may be ways to augment that and get around the two-person, two people per committee. So I'm just looking for a way to, address this problem and still adhere to this restriction that we apparently have on serving on committees. So my proposal would be that we create a task force and assign this to a subcommittee, and have a subcommittee deal with this process.
So just to be clear, this process that you're looking would be something that would fall within the constraints that are already on this board, right?
That
As
would
far as we have
Policies and
processes in place mandated by the CASA or the ordinance, I think it's the ordinance, that dictate to us how a board member can be removed, but it doesn't do kind of that nitty-gritty pre-vote process.
I think there's
Is that
very
right?
little language on how it happens. I think the only thing it says is we have the power by 2/3 majority to remove a board member. I think having been assigned the power in the ordinance, I think we have an obligation to create a
function.
process
Yeah.
that does it. So really, there is no process that I know of. I think there's plenty of models out there, and I think there's lots of information, but I think what we need to do is assemble that and come back with a process.
Vice Chair Fine?
I think your suggestion about assigning it to the Personnel Committee is a good suggestion. It's the one that has the non-consistent workload.
Yeah.
And I think that would make sense to me.
I don't think that we should develop such a process. I think we should consider the 2/3 vote the process. Like, that in and of itself is a process. It requires a supermajority agreement and a vote. And it might be simplistic, but I think it's better than some of the stuff you've proposed, because I'm really concerned that no one on the board is qualified to address a lot of the detail-oriented things you've raised in there. Like, for example, I think there's going to be a lot of confronting First Amendment issues. And I don't think anyone on the Personnel Committee, including myself, though I am a lawyer, is qualified to make rules about what people can and cannot say and when they can say it and in what forums, without getting us into an issue where we are writing policies that directly violate the First Amendment. So I think that that would be a really kind of unwise thing to do, and we should just leave the process at a very straightforward 2/3 vote. I mean, it's already onerous, right? It's already a supermajority, so it's not like something that's going to happen all the time. Has it ever happened that someone's been removed?
Nope. But we do have a lawyer right there, so that lawyer could give us advice in the committee.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. I think, I mean, 2/3 of a vote, what does that mean? I mean, we need to know what our parameters are and, you know, what we can and cannot do. I like his idea. And then, of course, that's why we have an attorney to say yes or no.
To kind of vet it
Yeah,
for
yeah,
us.
to vet it and to guide us. But I think there needs to be something besides, because it's too vague.
It's just
2/3
really
vote.
easy to write rules that aren't legal and then have to deal with them later in court. I mean, that's what happens all the time, and that's the kind of situation we work ourselves into when we start writing First Amendment rules.
Well, there's
Even
a
though
reason
we
that
have a very qualified lawyer, I don't think it's
The
wise.
council gave us a path, as Dr. Cass said, and I think that what also could happen, the opposite of what you're saying could also happen, which is that any willy-nilly thing could become a 2/3 vote just because
It
somebody got
never
tipped
has,
off.
though. We don't have a real reason
That
to
doesn't
fear
mean it
that.
can't happen in the future. I think that we should vote on his suggestion and vote against it if you want.
Tina, you look like you have something to add.
I would just, Chair Galloway, I would just like to make clear that any sort of policy or procedure would have to comport with the terms of the ordinance that does set forth, in addition to the 2/3 vote, reasonable cause and what that constitutes under the terms of the ordinance that has been encapsulated into the board's proposed policies and procedures. What that provides is in addition to any other reasonable cause, any conduct inconsistent with the requirements and provisions of this police oversight ordinance or a demonstrated inability to objectively adjudicate civilian complaints shall constitute cause for removal. So any sort of policy and procedure has to not only comply with the whole body of First Amendment law and any other sort of laws that may inadvertently or unintentionally be implicated, it also has to make sure that it complies with the ordinance. I'll point out that there is no obligation on this board to create a separate policy. If it would like to, it can, but it does not have to. And so long as, if there is a choice and it wants to proceed that way, the board is aware of the parameters under which it must operate so it doesn't run afoul of the ordinance. It's just important that the board is aware of those overlays and those requirements.
I think that's Dr. Cass's point exactly, is that that's where he started, was we have this power and how we do it should make sense. There should be some rhythm to it, some way in which it does, because the opposite could happen. You could have something that one or two of us think is egregious and other people don't, and because we haven't had this conversation, nothing happens. Because we haven't had that conversation ahead of time. So I just think though we haven't had this happen before, we certainly have had more issues of this type recently, and I think it behooves us to have the conversation. If we feel like it's too cumbersome or we're not going to go anywhere with it, we can decide we're not going to do it. But if we don't do the work up front, we'll never get anywhere. And I just think Dr. Cass has a good point.
If I could, I would like to respond to Member Van Deventer's issue, and that is that I think, yes, we have to be concerned about whether we have the expertise to deal with this. And I think one of the possible answers that comes back from a review of this is that, no, we're not smart enough to do this, so we're going to turn it over. We're going to, we're going to ignore it, and then it's going to go out into the, ether somewhere, and when it comes up, we won't be prepared to deal with it at all. But I think we can say, look, we think there's a better body that could make this decision. We should, if an issue like this comes up, we'll hire an outside agent to do this job. I mean, that's a possible answer. I'm not suggesting that as an answer, but I think if we ought to be smart enough to figure out whether we're smart enough to do this. So that's my suggestion. I think we have to address the problem, and this is my way of addressing it.
Well, I'm certainly comfortable with going back with Personnel Committee and kind of fleshing this out a little bit more than tonight, and after we've had some time to kind of think about it and maybe offer the opportunity for everybody on the board to provide input and opinions as to whether this should go anywhere, and then have that conversation and report back at the next board meeting a recommendation whether to codify something or not. I'm certainly comfortable with that.
Yeah. Is that your motion?
Yes, my motion is to assign this task to the Personnel Committee for reviewing.
Exploration.
For exploration. That's a good word.
A second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Okay, motion carries.
I would ask that you guys definitely include the attorney. This is really not about me. It really is, I think we're more likely to get in trouble with a policy than without. I think what Dr. Cass is saying, we need to be prepared and have a policy, and the policy is the good idea. And I think the policy is sort of the bad idea in this instance, because it is so easy to get it wrong and create landmines after which we can
And
get
we'll discover
sued.
that as we go.
Yeah, so.
Tina,
two
can
cents.
you be available on August 23rd?
Chair Galloway, what time is that meeting on
I
August
think
23rd?
it's at 9:30.
Let me see.
I thought that meeting had been canceled.
The last month's did.
It's on for.
Right now, yeah.
9:30 on August 23rd.
That's okay. I mean, you can let me know. We don't have to wait for that. But I think that that's a really good idea. Okay, so now we're up to you, Member Levis's motions.
So I'll go ahead and introduce the first motion here, which is in regards to motions of the board, a motion on motions, if you will. The motion that I would propose to make would be specifically that the Civilian Police Oversight Agency Board shall hereby amend its operating policies and procedures, Article 4, Part 6. As such, add Section B, no motion shall be approved by the board that directs action or communication without specific and final text of the proposal or communication being a part of the motion considered. To give a little background on this, I feel like our board is a little bit out of sync in this regards to how other similar boards and legislative bodies operate. To sort of give an example of this in another sphere, it would be akin to the city council holding a meeting and one of the councilors making a motion that they be allowed to write an ordinance on a particular topic and have that ordinance preemptively approved without ever seeing the text of the ordinance or the actual policy that the ordinance lays out. We did this last month as a board. I voted for this motion, and after pondering this and thinking about how a board ought to operate, it really disturbed me that I did in fact support that motion, and I think that that's just a very bad way to run a board. I understand that the reasoning behind that was that there was a deadline that we were trying to meet. Unfortunately, that just doesn't seem like a good excuse to delegate our authority in a pretty drastic manner. And I think that's also a violation of OMA, because the public cannot be expected to address language or issues in something that we authorize when it does not in fact exist at the time we authorize it. So that just seemed like a pretty basic and blatant error on our part, and I was certainly part of that. But it also comes to look at independence of the board. We're ceding our independence, whether it's to an individual board member or to an agent of the board, the director, an attorney, other staff. So I think that it probably should go without saying, but I actually saw this occur in the meeting where I came to observe as an audience member, and then again last month this occurred where we pre-authorized language or a letter without having seen the final text. So with that said. Yes, I started.
That's what I took that email as. These were proposed motions. So there's a motion?
Second.
Okay. Any additional discussion?
Yes, absolutely. We super need to discuss this. So I appreciate what you're getting at, and in an ideal world, I would like to do things just as you are describing. But first, I would say that, we've discussed that with our attorney, and delegating authority in that manner is compliant with the OMA. The OMA addresses that, and that's why we do things that way sometimes. So it's not a blatant OMA violation, certainly, but I don't think it's wise. I mean, I think we should avoid doing what you're describing the best we can. However, I think we need to not constrain ourselves, because, for example, in this next item 10E, we have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 policies that have come to us from APD. They've come to us, from PPRB, and we have 30 days to make comment. I've included here on the agenda when the comment is due. And so if we make such a motion, we're not going to be able to comment on any of these, because really the only options we have, based on the way the timelines are spelled out in 352, the options we really have are to discuss these policies tonight, determine what our recommendations are tonight, and then give someone the authority to put those in writing so that they can be delivered to APD. If we approve that motion, we're not going to be able to do that. And not being able to do that ever will cause us some major efficiency problems. So I think it's a good guiding principle to avoid doing what you're talking about. But I think to constrain ourselves in that way will just cause us problems, frankly. And so I don't love it when that happens, but usually when we do, the last time I can think of an example is when we went through our rules and procedures, and maybe some background context to that is that we had been doing it for months. We had been going over them and over them and over them, and line by lining and line by lining, and it was becoming just so cumbersome. And we had about 2 little pieces of language that we needed to finalize, and I asked the board to give me the authority to finalize that language with our attorney. And working together, we did our absolute best to make sure it reflected exactly what the board wanted before we sent it out. But these were really minor, it wasn't as if we wrote new rules and procedures. It wasn't a new document. It was stuff that we had talked about over and over and over. And no one wanted to do it again, especially for these 2 small pieces. And we needed to get them to the city and et cetera. And we just run into that kind of stuff. And I worry a motion like this will really impair our ability to address things timely on occasion. And so I would say it would be unwise to constrain ourselves in that way.
Another example from the last meeting was the letter to the judge, and for Chantel's signature. And we had a discussion in which we went over what it was that we wanted to bring up. Mr. Harness mentioned some things, we talked about them, and then we summarized them without exact wording, but we summarized them. now we see it's in our packet this time. If we wanted to bring it up as an objection, we could certainly do that. I understand what you're saying. I think it's wise, but the truth is, we can only make decisions in this meeting. And that's a hard and fast OMA rule. And so it's not like we could do it by email or do it some other way. We have 12 meetings a year, and it's either on the agenda and done or not, or we're waiting another 30 to 60 days. So while I love what you're saying, I think from a practical standpoint, I agree with Ms. Vanderbenner.
I think that as long as, and you have, you know, in theory, this is done with Director Harness, this is done with our attorney, Ms. Gooch right now, but whomever that may be, plus one of us or two of us that are on this board. And at some point, we have to be able to trust that there are competent people that are going to take the decisions that are made in like the what is the word? Yeah, that we can make that happen and fine tune and write it down and get it ready and out for distribution. We had to do it a handful of times with the ordinance. I think it's just part of it. It's not one person who does it. There's checks and balances and
Spread around,
accountability.
yeah.
Dr. Cass and then Valerie?
I mean, I think it's important that we, once again, that we have a process and that we follow the process. I think that the spirit of this is to substantially get the language right, not to just make a nebulous sort of suggestion and have a discussion around it and then turn this over to one or two board members and the attorney to finish it out. And I think that's what we're trying to avoid. And I think that's what Member Oliva's motion is directed to. And I think the timeline issue is not a valid issue. I think, first of all, recommendations made around policy are somewhat flexible, and in fact, we're in the process of renegotiating that timeline with APD, and there's our co-negotiator over sitting in the back row. And so I think if we put the deadline ahead of the content, then I think we're making a big mistake. And so I'd rather get the right thing done late than to have the wrong thing done on time. And that's what I think that's the difference in the decision here. And so I support this motion.
Valerie?
Well, I understand his concerns, and I think that we go on a case by, well, I guess I could also use the word case by case study when we go over if it's a word or two, but we always have we can make the objection that we want to go to the full committee and call a special meeting on timelines. I mean, we just don't give free rein. It's a decision on each ordinance or whatever we're working on.
Yeah. Tara or Eric, do either of you have anything else you want to add?
I'd like to close the floor.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, all yours.
So I wanted to first address the issue of efficiency being raised, and I completely agree that we need to be efficient, and we have these deadlines laid out here, August 26th, September 2nd, and I think we all signed up for this job understanding that there was a fair deal of work in preparation required for it, and so I don't think that it's really a good excuse to say that, well, we didn't have time to meet the requirements laid out before us. I was able to read through all these policies that are going to come before us tonight. Some of them I have questions and comments on, some of them I don't, and I'm prepared to make a motion based on my observations of those policies, and I think we all should be.
But what about the
Expanding on that,
writing?
excuse me.
Sorry.
Expanding on that, we also have subcommittee meetings that should be addressing this well before these dates are to progress upon us. And so that's also our opportunity as board members to give our feedback and make sure that we have, and I perhaps the motion needs to be rephrased slightly, and I'm open to that. I would say substantial text of our intent prepared, meaning that we should be prepared to basically have everything together. Now, I understand, there may be some editing, some minor changes that go on, but the substantial text of what we're trying to do is our job. Our job is to be prepared for these dates, and other legislative forums and boards across the city and country do this every day, and they don't just impose deadlines on themselves and then say, well, we don't have time to address this at the meeting tonight, so we're going to give one city councilor the authority to write this whole ordinance, and it's approved. That isn't how this works in the legislative process, and there's no reason that we are above that to say that, you know, we did most of the work, or we were pretty much prepared, but we need to have that flexibility. I think we have the flexibility. We have had the time to do these things, and as members, you know, it's our job to be prepared.
Chair Galloway, could I just respond just with one detail here?
Sure.
Okay, so Board Member Olivas, if you look at these SOP 1-35, SOP 1-41, SOP 1-57, these SOPs were sent to us from APD on August 2nd. That was the day after the Policy and Procedure Subcommittee met, and our recommendations are due September 2nd, which is before this board meets again. So how is it possible to have the substantial text prepared in a way where we can get that text back in front of the board and to APD within the timeline by which it's due? I don't see a way for it to be done. I mean, unless everyone is very amenable to holding a lot of special meetings. But I mean, we already all do so much work, and the subcommittees are a lot of work, I can't fit more board in my life. It already takes up so much time. But the only way to do what you're proposing, but to also adhere to what we've agreed to do in participating in this policy process, would be for us to address these by holding a special meeting. And that's the kind of stuff those are the kinds of problems we run into when we have this like substantial text rule.
I'm gonna go on ahead and call this. The only objection that I have, and I don't think it's what you're intending to communicate, but just for clarity's sake, I disagree wholly with the idea that one person is allowed to write and kind of create any kind of policy or ordinance or letter or anything without the board having already given the spirit of, that's the word I was looking for, what it intends to be communicated. And so I just disagree wholly that one person has that, power or ability. I think that one person is tasked with compiling and writing and summarizing, whatever the case may be, the direction the board wants to move in and has voted on, because we always take action and then we delegate that those actions be written out or whatever by one person in conjunction with our attorney and with Director Harness.
Mr. Larios, as she explained to you a current situation, do you have a response to that? Or what would you feel, how would we solve that problem if we voted in favor?
So I think that that's a fair point that Member Van de Venderen makes there, and I think that goes back to our relationship with APD, where that's really not appropriate that we're given a policy that we received, I think it was about a week before this meeting, much less before our policy meeting. So you certainly have a valid point there, and I think we have a valid point as a board in saying, we're not going to comment on this, we'll give you comment after our next meeting, because, again, it's kind of an artificial deadline being imposed upon us, and I think that with some communication with the department,
it's written
that can
down.
be
Yeah.
I'm not sure
negotiated.
I'm not sure that it's an artificial deadline. I think that there are timelines that are in place that we have to abide by and they have to abide by. I don't think that somebody just like threw a dart at a calendar. One more and then we're going to
Okay, I was going to ask Director Harness, as the example she gave, can you tell us why some are shorter deadlines and some are longer?
Chair Galloway, Member St. John, this is just a function of APD's policy procedures as the example that's being discussed, because they're working diligently to review their policies, and there is and so they're working on their timeline, which, I've been here for almost 4 years now, and we've really fought to just get our place at the table without dictating APD's timelines. And they're certainly not artificial, especially if this is a CASA-related policy that has to go to the monitor. And so it's just a function of APD getting back into step now with Mr. Chappell being head of the policies and him getting them back to work. So they're going to be churning these out every week or so, and that's the expectation as they move forward. So as it relates to Member Olivas's motion in the context of the policy deadlines, as Member Vandeventer points out, that's a function of APD's policy development that won't change unless there's a significant change to 3-52.
Tina?
Chair Galloway, if I may just provide some information to the board and some other parameters and times in which time limits have come up and been imposed on the board. Because of the pending CASA court case, there are certain deadlines imposed by the judicial structure of that case over which the board has no control, nor does the city, nor does any of the parties to that lawsuit. So, for instance, at last month's board meeting, I reminded the board that if they wanted to have a letter or an opinion or information presented to the court, not knowing when that deadline was going to be imposed, it was prudent upon the board to consider that, address it, and decide whether or not it wanted to participate in the process with the federal court. I understand that by happenstance we were very lucky and that deadline is set for tomorrow. But at the time of our meeting, we did not know when that was going to happen. So I just provide the caveat that it's not just the city or APD that imposes deadlines on this board. It's also judicial functions through the CASA case. And thankfully right now, no pending litigation involving the board, but in the event that happens again in the future, those are deadlines over which the board has no control as well. So I point that out, not one way or another on the motion that's before the board. I just raise it, so it's something that is in your minds at the time, and also that it's clear under the OMA that you obviously can have special meetings at any time, whenever you would like, as long as they are properly noticed. So if the board is inclined to vote in favor of this motion, it's just prudent that y'all understand that we cannot have votes going on via email, that it would have to be through special meetings called by the chair. And I just provide that background for purposes of the legal parameters under which you all have to operate. Thank you.
So we have a motion and a second. Can you restate your motion?
Yes. The Civilian Police Oversight Agency Board shall hereby amend its operating policies and procedures, Article 4, Part 6. As such, add Part B, no motion shall be approved by the board that directs action or communication without specific and final text of the proposal or communication being part of the motion considered.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Those opposed?
Aye.
Aye. So we have a 3-3 split. I believe that means the motion fails.
That's
Is that correct? Okay. Next one on the list, Executive Director Evaluation.
So I propose the Civilian Police Oversight Agency Board shall hereby direct the Personnel Subcommittee to reevaluate the process of evaluating the agency director. Emphasis shall be placed on utilizing best practices for evaluating executive leadership in government and private industry. The committee shall submit a revised evaluation process for the director position to the CPOAB within 3 months. My rationale behind this is coming into this as a civilian who's been following this board and this process for some time, and as now a member of the board. I'm familiar with the current process of evaluating the director, which basically consists of a survey of interested parties and stakeholders that the board selects. I think that a survey is certainly one valid way, one means of evaluating an executive authority. However, I think that Mr. Harness has, or any executive director, this isn't about this particular individual, has a job description that involves a number of duties and responsibilities. Most of those can be measured in some way by some metric, whether that's data, whether that's meeting deadlines, all kinds of ways that those metrics can be analyzed by the board. And I have seen and heard in the community and within this board frustration with the position of the executive director, with the agency, and ultimately the director is the authority over the agency and we are the authority over the director. So if there is unhappiness with the job performance of that director, it's incumbent upon us, the board, to examine that position in a critical manner and determine whether the job requirements are being fulfilled. And I don't think that the current mechanism does justice to what we should do. And I don't say this with malice or any particular direction that I think this should go. I think that it's just incumbent upon the board that we have a more broad evaluation of the director position. And I don't have a specific proposal at this time for how to do that. And it sort of may be like the motion we discussed earlier, Member Cass's motion, where it's something that we look at and decide, I don't think we want to go there. But I think that it's incumbent upon the Personnel Committee to take a look at this and see if there's a better way to do this using sort of what other groups are using and see if we can find a better way that will make sure we're doing the best job we can.
Did you
I think that's
make a
actually a
motion?
motion.
I started with the motion, yeah.
Okay, and I second.
Okay. Have you seen the review? The
The question?
yeah, the
Yes.
questionnaire? You
Yes.
have, okay.
I
I'm-
haven't seen the most recent.
Okay, okay, I'm completely fine, and I think that it's absolutely appropriate that the subcommittee, personnel subcommittee, reevaluate and evaluate just even, I don't know if annually is necessary, but definitely periodically, the criteria that's being used and where that's sourced from and who the recipients are of the survey and, or whatever vehicle that may be. I have no problem with that whatsoever. Anybody else? So we have a motion, I'll second it, I guess.
Okay. I
Any
mean, I
other
think
discussion?
I defer to your expertise in this area, so if you're fine with it, that,
Totally fine with it.
okay.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Great, motion carries. So we'll take a look at that on our, oh, sorry. Yes, sir.
Chair Galloway, although not expressed this evening at this meeting, Member Olivas, in his preface to this motion, expresses that the board and the community don't have full confidence in the findings of the investigations of the agency. And I'd like to know on what that is based.
Sure, I'm happy to address that. So I base that observation mostly on the members of the board who feel that a rigorous review of complaints is necessary and required, because I feel that we all are expected to review these complaints, and so the fact that we're reviewing these multiple times, as well as you, as well as your investigators who are producing this work product. So the fact that there is that feeling on the board that this is something, that these are work products that are not to be completely 100% trusted, indicates to me that there is some level of discomfort. Now, there's always going to be some level of discomfort with anything, right? If I order a pizza for everybody here, somebody's not going to like what I get on it, right? So, and in your position, in the agency's position, and our position as a board, that's going to happen all the time, where people are not going to be happy with the findings. But I feel like this is important to make sure that we have an evaluation process that looks at outcomes and specific metrics for the position of the executive director to make sure that you're doing your job as to the best of your ability, so that we have full confidence in the agency, because ultimately you are the position of the executive director is the authority of the agency that we are responsible with overseeing. We don't look at individual investigators, we don't look at that sort of thing. So you are ultimately responsible for what the agency produces, and I think that we owe it to the board and to the public to make sure that we're doing a good job of overseeing that position.
Chair Galloway and Member Olivas, I understand absolutely you should evaluate my performance and the work product from from the CPOA. But I would direct you to IMR 1 through IMR 9 as to the work product that's produced by these investigators that do the work. And for having not reviewed an investigative file, I find it offensive that you would make this kind of judgment about the work product from the agency without having full knowledge.
Sorry.
So I am not making this assertion that I don't have confidence in your agency's findings or your job performance. I specifically stated that. But this is with no malice. I'm not looking to go on a witch hunt here. What I'm looking to do is make sure that we have the best process in place to evaluate the position and make sure that the work product being produced is as good as it gets. I have no personal issue with the quality of the investigations, and I'll be the first to tell you. There's people that have been on this board a lot longer than me that have a lot more experience looking at these investigative files and looking at these investigations, knowing what to look for. I'll be the first person to tell you that. This isn't about your investigations. I only stated what you already know, is that there's people in the public and there's people on this board that probably don't have 100% confidence in every investigation that comes out of your office. That's just a fact of life. But I think as a board, one of our only responsibilities, really, one of our only powers, if you will, is to oversee the executive director. So if we're not doing a good job of that, then we're responsible, at least in part, for any perception that the agency is not doing his job or not doing as good of a job as it could be.
I think it's just a starting point for a conversation and seeing if what is already in place is sufficient, if it works, if there's anything to improve upon. And I think that as far as the evaluation itself, and you know this is very personal to me, if there's places to improve, I'm absolutely open to that. Even though this body, minus Tara and Eric, felt as though what I drafted was a vast improvement on what was already in place, we may find that even though the monitoring team is pleased and happy and everything's going well, maybe there's something we can do even better. And I think that that's kind of at the heart of what we're talking about here, is look and see if there's an opportunity to improve upon the evaluation tool itself, what it is that we're looking at. Everything may be great, but where can we go? Where can we do better? That's how I'm kind of interpreting what you're saying. Tina?
Chair Galloway, I believe the motion has already passed. I just have a point of clarity that I'd like to confirm. Are we discussing the evaluation process that's already been done for the past year, or are you talking about moving forward and having it for the subsequent years? In fairness to the director, I think that the board should provide notice if the process is going to change, so that he is aware, whoever the executive director is at the time, is aware of what the evaluation tool is going to look like. It's just unclear from the motion and the vote and the discussion.
I don't think that I'm going to be okay if it's not going forward. I think that would be terribly unfair to change things midstream. So no, I won't be supporting anything that is retroactively
The specific motion remanded an evaluation of the evaluation process to the Personnel Subcommittee. No action was taken. We asked the subcommittee to take a look at the process of evaluating the executive director. Nothing happened.
Yeah,
It's
I think
unfortunately, but that's kind of where it is.
No, that motion carried. We're
I
gonna
know,
take
but
a
I'm
look at
saying,
it.
like, we didn't really take an action other than to ask the
The
committee to look at it.
Yeah,
Thank you for clarifying.
you're welcome. Robert's Rules of Order.
Last
No, fine.
So this one is fairly basic here. The Civilian Police Oversight Agency Board shall hereby direct the Civilian Police Oversight Agency to develop and provide training to all members of the Civilian Police Oversight Board on Robert's Rules of Order and the professional operation of public meetings. CPOAB members shall be required to complete an orientation training in this subject and shall complete an annual refresher training on these topics. The agency shall finalize stated training program within 3 months. Further, the board shall amend policies and procedures, Article 3, Part 6, Section B, to add number 13, training on Robert's Rules of Order and general meeting conduct and operation shall occur annually.
So
That was the
that's a
motion.
motion.
Yes.
Second.
I'm going to ask you to alter your motion just slightly and pretty insignificantly to us, but probably very significantly to the agency. I don't think that they should have to develop content that already exists. That's the only thing I would ask.
You can, I think we should try to follow the process here, and I think you can propose an amendment.
And that's
So-
exactly what I'm doing.
Okay, so I would guess, I'm asking you to phrase it in those terms.
Okay, so I'm proposing an amendment that we lose the develop training. But other than that, I'm good. Anybody else?
Are we voting on the amended motion, or? So
He's
is
got
there a
He's
second?
got to amend it.
Is there a second?
Okay,
to
so
the
I would concur with the amendment. The amendment would read, I'm not going to read the entire text, I'll just read the first part here. The Civilian Police Oversight Agency Board shall hereby direct the Civilian Police Oversight Agency to provide training to all members of the CPOAB on Robert's Rules of Order and the professional operation of public meetings.
Second. Any other discussion? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. Executive Committee. This feels like it would be yours. Is that not yours?
Actually, okay, I didn't see this on the agenda. What's it say on the agenda?
It says Executive Committee.
Okay, well, in the letter I wrote regarding creating a process for removal of a board member, I suggested at that time that it might be handled in the executive committee. And so if this is in reference to that, then I think we've discussed this to the point, I mean, we've dealt with that in the previous motion. But given that it is on the agenda, I think this is something that we should deal with. We have an executive committee which is on record as existing, and we've even specified its membership, although I think that's not consistent with our own bylaws, because I think the membership is appointed by the chair. But in any case, I think either we disband the executive committee or we start having executive committee meetings. So that's the discussion that I'm interested in having, and I'll
And you
leave
know-
it at that.
And you know, I fully support the idea of an executive committee, and for the two of you, because you may not be fully aware of what the idea is, would be essentially what we've talked about as a committee of committee chairs to be able to get together, kind of pre-game the board meeting and develop the agenda, handle any kind of emergency things that may come up. The issue that I think that we have right now, because I was even thinking about this earlier this evening, is I still think that we're down a board member to be able to fully execute that vision. And so until we have a full complement of the board, I don't think that we can do anything, which is why I'm so interested, Mr. Moya, in when we're going to get a new board member.
Another obstacle is that we are constrained in that we can only be on 2 committees each. And I appreciate that the executive subcommittee would be useful, but it's not as substantive to the heart of the work given to us by the ordinance, and I much prefer to be engaged in like what I kind of consider the real work. And I don't want to have to join the executive committee and forsake one of the, major like subject matter area of interests that I have. And so I would prefer the idea of disbanding the executive committee. There could be, couldn't there always be a conversation amongst chairs only that wasn't a committee, is there a way to work around that if it's for such a limited purpose?
And I'm just gonna, while you kind of ponder that, I'm just gonna say the other option that we have available is use it as an ad hoc committee if it's needed. And the only time that I can think of that something of that nature was absolutely needed was in the 252 rewrite, in that beginning process where we called together just a handful of people to kind of make an executive decision and move forward. Tina?
Chair Galloway, while the OMA doesn't apply to your subcommittee meetings, the board's policies and procedures indicate that we strive to comply with the OMA whenever possible. So it would give me pause to support the idea of having an ad hoc subcommittee unless, of course, that notice complied with the OMA so that the public would be aware of what was happening and when it was happening. I will note that the chair has authority to call a special meeting if or when there's ever a need for the board to take immediate or swift action, as long as there's 72-hour notice provided to the public. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I mean, we could, well, I don't know that in that particular instance, we would have met that 72-hour deadline. I think that wouldn't have happened. So I don't know that it could always, but I think it's probably more likely than not that we could call a special meeting if there was anything super
But then
major.
what's even the point of the executive committee?
Then you
'Cause
wouldn't
that's
need
just
it.
a meeting.
Yep, then you wouldn't need it.
I see. A meeting on the meeting? A meeting about the meeting?
Yeah.
Rather not.
I would much prefer, like, I really like that idea for those what-if scenarios, but we do have more limitations than we had when we first started having those conversations, most notably the ordinance rewrite, limiting us to 2 committees. But
It doesn't seem like we've had a huge need for such a committee in recent times that,
no, the biggest thing that I would like to see change in the way that we handle our business is that the committee chairs are more,
communicative.
exactly, when it comes to what's going to go on the agenda and what things need to be in place, and not so reactive, that there be a process developed for that, but it doesn't require an executive committee to do it.
Tina, if we were to have an email that was included all of the committee heads, but was short of a quorum, that was solely about what items are being placed on the agenda, would we have an OMA violation, or is that an email that can work with under the OMA?
Chair Galloway, Member Van Deventer, it probably would be okay. It's my understanding at this point that the way things get onto the agenda is through the executive director and the agency. I'm not sure entirely how the process works. I don't know how the sausage gets made, if you will, but I know what it looks like when it comes to me to make sure that it's compliant. If you don't have a rolling quorum that is created through your emails, you are fine. It's the rolling quorum that the board should not have happen. And what does that mean? That means that you have the 4 chairs discussing something, and then one of those members forwards it to the rest of their committee to make sure that they've gotten it right, for instance. Now you have a rolling quorum, and now you are in violation of the OMA. So it would have to be a very skilled, precise, careful process. But if it's just the 4 chairs discussing what they want on the agenda, no, there is no issue.
Or if it's one chair sending it to the chair of the board and to the executive director, then we don't have any issues.
Chair Galloway, that's correct, unless it somehow makes its way back through the subcommittees for discussion, comment, or action. If it's simply a receipt, please put this on the agenda, and there's no discussion about it that goes to a quorum of the board, there is no problem.
Okay. I think that that's a bigger conversation we don't need to have right now, but
My motion is to disband the executive committee.
okay, we have a motion. Do we have a second? Okay. Any more discussion about disbanding the executive committee? All right, all in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Okay. That is no longer a committee at this time, anyway. All right, Member Van Deventer, you're up.
Okay, great. All right, guys. SOP 1-2. We have very many policies to go through, and I want to have an efficient as discussion as possible. And so how I would like to do this is I would like to first introduce the policy by name and number, tell you what my recommendations are, and then go down the list and I'll write down everyone's recommendations, and then we can open up a discussion. Does that sound workable to everybody? Okay, so the first SOP is SOP 1-2. Our comments are due August 26th. This is the social media policy. I essentially just have one recommendation, which we began to discuss at our policy subcommittee meeting. But this recommendation comes from the agency based on some issues that popped up in their investigations. And I think I might need Director Harness to supplement what I'm about to provide here, but it was to essentially consider one of two things, which would be either to strike the section at the bottom of page 4, 1-2-6, department sanctioned social media use, to either strike that or alternatively to elaborate upon it, create rules, a process for audit, just expand upon those ideas, because I think the concern, what's happened in a case is there is this elaborate social media policy which basically prohibits a lot of officers representing themselves as APD officers on their, social media platforms. But then there's this hanging section that talks about department-sanctioned social media use. And the way that that has been interpreted at times in the ranks is that an individual officer can ask their supervisor, their sergeant, they can say, hey, can you sanction my use of social media so that I can be a representative of the department? And maybe it's an email, and maybe the chief or the sergeant says, yeah, sure. And then that sworn personnel starts using their social media in a way that's inconsistent with the rest of the SOP, and that no one is really actively monitoring. So they have issues where maybe an officer appears to be representing APD when he shouldn't be, saying things that aren't copacetic with the rest of this policy. And so the idea is that you could just get rid of that altogether, or I think this came up at our meeting, you could clarify within this section that the sanctioned social media is social media run by the department itself and not individual sworn personnel. Or you could still allow individual sworn personnel to request a permission that allows them, that is, sanctioned social media use, where they could still represent themselves as an officer, et cetera. But this part of the policy would then need to be built out in such a way where there would be monitoring of that social media use, auditing of it perhaps. And so there's some different options here, but the way these things don't fit together very well, and it does come up in cases. And so that's the recommendation essentially that's come from the agency. So, anything from you,
No,
Ms.
nothing
Ermi?
from me.
Okay.
What you said sounds
Okay.
reasonable.
Do you have any thoughts?
I have things about this policy that I didn't love, that were just somewhat confusing to me, but because I don't have any specific changes to recommend, I'll go ahead and forego my comments for now.
Okay.
I think that if there's a way to simplify this by just cutting a section out rather than trying to open up the door of adding more content right now. These policies are reviewed annually anyway. I think that buys us some time to be able to have the conversations that are necessary to develop that appropriately and accurately. So
Okay.
if we can simplify it for now with the idea that that's something we want to look at moving forward, developing the content further, then I think that's where I'd like to go with it.
Okay.
I agree with Chair Galloway.
Do you have anything, Dr. Cass, on this?
So could you shorten your recommendation to a line or two, or to one or two options? Just-
Well, actually, let me clarify what I was saying, which is that we can actually make recommendations in the alternative. We can just propose that they consider either doing one of two things, getting rid of this section or developing upon this section in a way that, considers monitoring of the social media use, an official way of getting permission, some sort of process. So we could do it in the alternative, or if we think that one of those things is the best way to go, we could just recommend the one. So it would be either strike the section, ask them to develop a process for permission and auditing, or maybe clarify this section and confine this session to be solely about department-run social media. So you keep the section, but you prohibit individual sworn officers from being allowed to have sanctioned social media pages.
And I think it's finding that line between the specific and the general that's important here. And I think the way you initially phrased it, or just now phrased it without, the last little bit of specificity, I think is better. And I would approve, I would suggest that that's the way we proceed on these, is that, I think we can flesh out enough of the language here to where it may not be completely specific, but it is specific enough to proceed with, with the sense of the recommendation. It's somewhere between what Member Olivas recommended and in terms of being completely specific, but after all, and being overly broad. But I think after all, this is a recommendation. It's not, so it's going to reflect sort of a composite view, I think, of a number of people here. So I would be happy with going with your recommendation to, that's phrased approximately the way you said it. I'm going along with this, so.
Okay.
In this roundabout way.
I'm so sorry, I'm really confused by that, though. Because you proposed a couple of different options for us.
Yeah.
So
I wanted to add a little bit to that. In our conversations, because we did discuss this policy a little bit with Mr. Chappell, also in our policy and in our policy meeting, and it seemed pretty clear to me that from his answer that this section that we're debating here did specifically concern only department-sanctioned social media, meaning the official APD Twitter, the official APD Facebook, the official APD Instagram. So it seems to me that in my opinion, the best recommendation we can give is that we have very specific clarity on that from them, that that's what this is referring to. And I believe the rest of the policy, the first chunk of it, refers to what you're talking about, which is, sort of these quasi-sanctioned, is it okay if I post a picture of me in my car, that kind of thing, that they seem to be trying to get a better handle on with the first section. That's kind of my read on it.
Yeah, it's certainly an option to just ask, that they develop this section to make it, very, very clear the department-sanctioned social media pages are those pages run by the department, and that individual sworn personnel cannot operate department-sanctioned social media pages. We could make that recommendation.
I would go along with that if you leave out two varies.
Oh, well, I write better than I speak most of the time, so just bear with me here. Okay, so I'm happy to write a letter to that effect if the board is comfortable with that and would like to take a position through a motion.
I move that we ask for this, or that we recommend this policy, but with the added language of department-sanctioned social media pages.
Okay, I'll second your motion.
Okay, all in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Great.
Would you like me in the letter to include a background to explain why we're making the motion? Or should I just keep it very simple as, you know, as to what the recommendation is and that's it? Sometimes I feel like context helps the reader understand why we're making a recommendation, but it's not necessary. I'm just asking the question.
I think to include simply that we're trying, I think simply to include that we're trying to clarify what social media platforms, or not platforms, but instances they're referring to. The official
Okay.
account or the personal account being quasi-official.
Okay, so have you guys then delegated the authority to me to write this recommendation letter and send it, being that it's due August 26th? If you guys are uncomfortable with that, I could write these and we could bring them back at the next meeting, but they'll just be really late. So,
I personally don't have any issue with you writing the letter. We've seen what you've done and have been fond of it, actually, I think, so.
okay. Are there any major objections then? I don't know.
I'll support that, but I would just propose that in the future, we do a better job at the policy committee of coming to the board with, basically with that letter in hand, saying, here is
Yes.
what we want to forward to APD, and so I would say I will support it this time, but I
wholeheartedly
think we
agree with
need
you.
to, as a committee, work towards
And
that.
I normally do get that done. This would be an exception, but I normally do try to get those done and bring them to this forum so that everyone could see them in their finished form before.
And just for the sake of, you know, having this conversation or not having this conversation again through the rest of these policies, can we say that that holds true for all of them? And that if we move on these things with the language that we want you to draft, that we're delegating that to you, Chelsea?
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so the next policy is SOP 1-5. It's sexual harassment in the workplace. I only have 2 recommendations. One is small and tiny, and one is big. The tiny one is that on page 3, paragraph 3, that the word must be changed to shall. Shall is the better word to use generally, and APD has a goal in these, a stated goal of having these sound like they're coming from one voice. And so I'm going to be recommending that language change in lots of policies. So that's the small one. And then the big one is that this policy doesn't have really, APD is also trying to avoid having, like, you know, allowing for sanctions but not being descriptive. There's like 7 levels of sanctions. And this sexual harassment policy mentioned like sanctions conduct, but it just says up to and including termination, which includes all categories 1 through 7. And so it doesn't really ever say this type of conduct is sanctionable in this way. And it builds in tons and tons of discretion for sanctions into this policy. And so my second recommendation would be that they further define sanctions within this policy throughout.
I would agree with that, and I would like Director Harness to comment on that, because I believe he's the expert on sanctions.
And just for clarification, then the sanctions are given to us, like the proposed sanctions are given to us in this policy. I've always,
That's where we get them, yeah.
right? Like that's what I've always taken these numbers in the red boxes to mean when I'm reviewing these things, is that those are the proposed sanctions. Okay.
Chair Galloway, yes, that's correct. Those are the proposed sanctions. And I'm sorry I missed what
It was
needed
that
clarification.
the sexual harassment policy lacked specificity in the sanctions, I believe. Does that sum it up?
Yes, thank you.
So,
Well, I mean, we do, generally speaking, have sanction levels in here, and so I guess the up to and including termination, Chelsea, can you point to that a little bit? Because it's not throughout the policy that it's up to
I
and
guess you're
including
right.
termination. Some of these have sanction levels associated with them. Some of them are sanctioned 1 through 7.
Oh,
But
yeah,
there's
you know what?
only 2 that I see like that, where the sanctions would be, kind of,
Loose.
yeah. Otherwise, they're pretty well defined, I feel like, in here,
Yeah, you might be right about that.
except for, and I'm assuming that this isn't what you're talking about, when the sanction levels are like 5 through 7. Because I would interpret that you're going to start at a level 5 and up to 7.
Yeah. Yeah,
Right.
I might need to retract what I said. It might be in only a couple of places where they are very broad, and maybe that's, I mean, that could be, I assume it's intentional.
So.
Maybe
Well,
we
let me,
leave it alone.
I would like to get a reading on how you feel about this. I mean,
Chair Galloway, member Dr. Cass, they do try to avoid ranges for sanctions. However, sometimes those ranges are unavoidable because of the breadth of the behavior that's trying to be, that is being covered in that particular paragraph. So, for example, if you lose your squad computer because you left your squad unlocked versus losing your squad computer because somebody broke in and stole it, there's the level of sanction. Or if you accessed a website that contracted a virus because you were doing police work versus non-police work, those kinds of things. They try to avoid ranges, but sometimes it's unavoidable. Also, when there is not a sanction, you refer to the paragraph above for that sanction level. It carries down. We've tried to get them to put an NA or something there by every paragraph, but at this point they're unwilling to do that. So sometimes when there's not a number there, you have to refer to the paragraph above.
So would it be helpful to just kind of talk about the 2 lines in this policy that do have the 1 through 7 sanction levels?
Sure.
There's only 2 places.
Yeah. So the first one is, make sure I'm getting it right. Any department supervisor who observes or has knowledge of harassment must immediately bring the matter to the attention of the department chief of staff and department HR administrator or city human resources office. Failure to do so may result in disciplinary action up to and including termination.
So that's the first one.
So, and I can see sort of why they would want a range here. I can see an instance where, this was something where it was perhaps a single incident and I don't know, they were transferred between departments at that time or something like that. It seems like a lower level violation than if this was something where there was a consistent pattern of multiple complaints being made against someone under a supervisor's supervision, and they continually, there was a pattern and practice, if you will, of not reporting to these appropriate authorities, and that would seem to me a higher level of sanction.
And Director Harness, each of these sanction levels, even if it's a 1, are documented someplace, correct? In the employee's personnel file, I would assume?
Chair Galloway, yes, that's correct. On their personnel history, their history of sanctions are listed, yes.
Okay. So you do have that knowledge to refer back to?
Yeah. Yeah, I might say
Just
that we
resend
just
it?
leave it. Unless anyone objects. Everyone seems to concur.
I would agree with just leaving it. I mean, I won't belabor the issue, but I think I don't think we should tie the hands of someone who's making a judgment about this, who's in a responsible position to do so, such as the chief, which is, I believe, the person involved in termination. So I would leave it, there's no reason for us to exercise, some constraint on that kind of a decision in this case, I think. Maybe in other cases, but not in this case.
So
I
then
agree.
it just goes back to the shall?
Yeah. Unless anyone else had any substantive recommendations about this policy. No? What do you guys think about the shall changing? So minor.
Those are
but-
the kind of things that I think happen at OPA and PPRB, and when it gets to this stage, it seems to me that's gone beyond the substantive, or it doesn't rise to the level of a substantive recommendation. And I would hope that we would be associated with substantive recommendations, or just say,
Yeah.
we support this policy.
Catch it next
Sure,
year.
I mean, I guess I just thought of it as like facilitating APD's own stated goal and writing these policies as having them all sound like they're written from one uniform
And
voice.
I think you've gotten that message across, because the messenger, he's receiving it in the back row again.
He's
so
only one person.
But he's a very important person in this process, and especially for things like that. So I
Okay.
believe I think we're accomplishing our purpose.
Okay, so
Fair
then
enough.
for this policy, we shall do a, kind of one of our boilerplate received, no substantive comment at this time. Is
Yep.
that okay? Okay. Next policy, 279, lead. This is law enforcement assisted diversion. And I think there are a lot of kind of unanswered process questions presented by this policy. But I don't think that I have the answers to provide. And I think this is a pilot program, and they're gonna be kind of asking themselves those questions and answering them. That's what the pilot is for. So my thinking is, for my own personal position is that we just endorse the policy because it's a good policy, and ask them to just ensure that they review it timely or something like that.
I'd like to echo that, but I did attend the PPRB meeting where this was forwarded, and it was, I believe, a unanimous vote to forward it. But let me just give you some of the information that I got from the PPRB meeting. And first of all, the purpose, I'll read you the purpose. Purpose of Department Lead is to provide guidelines for employees trained in the Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion Program, which provides for the diversion of low-level nonviolent offenders into treatment. This was, as Member Van de Vendor mentioned, it is a pilot program, and I think that was reinforced when, we heard a couple of reviews about this. It was reviewed at the amici briefing on Tuesday, as well as at the PPRB meeting. And so they really need this policy in place in order to go forward with the program. And of course, because it's a pilot program, at this point they have one case manager, and they're planning to train 6 field officers in order to divert people into from going to jail to getting some other getting into a better program. And so there's a lot to be learned, and I think the way you learn that is to create the pilot program, and then periodically review the progress, and that has been discussed at the POB, or the OPA, at the PPRB meeting, and other places as well. So I think they're on the right track. It's a good program, but it's new. Right. So I would say that we just I would recommend that we, show our support for this program and recognize that it's in the process of being created.
Is everyone in agreement with that? Okay, so my motion will be that for SOP 2-79 lead, that our recommendation letter reflects an endorsement of this policy.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Great.
Okay.
I just wanted to raise a quick point of order on the last policy, 1-5. We didn't make an official motion or
Oh, thank
anything
you.
on that. I don't know if we want to go back to that.
We should. For SOP 1-5, my motion will be that we inform APD of our lack of substantive comments regarding this SOP at this time.
Second.
second.
Oh, go for it. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Great.
Okay, moving right along. SOP 3-33. Okay, so this is performance evaluation and management systems. I don't have anything on this. This policy, as well as another one that came through OPA, caused us to have a discussion that resulted in a part of our APD presentation today about the development of career paths, and we wanted to get an update on that because it's something that we had previously recommended. And so we got the update. I think what they've done so far sounds really great. My only, recommendation stemming from this was that I hope they have professional development in mind since it's so interrelated. And I don't have anything aside from that.
If I could comment, this was also at the PPRB meeting that I attended, and it's somewhat different than a professional development, than the professional development that was discussed, but
Well, yeah.
but they are related, yes. And again, this is a pilot program. And at this point, I think it really needs to be exercised in order to see what's going to happen. Because the idea is that there's going to be performance indicators that they look at, that police officers have for the primary one is going to be use of force, but it won't be the only one. I think there's about a dozen, 7 maybe. What's the number? 7 performance indicators that'll be used, and with those performance indicators, they think that they can make a better prediction when an officer needs correction to his career. And I think that they've got a lot of data that they can use to sort of test the model, and before they actually get very far in implementing the program. But I think, again, they need to have a process in place in order to do that, run this model through its paces. So I think it's a good idea, and they'll have to learn as they go. So I support it, and I recommend it. But
Director Harness?
Chair Galloway, yes, just so that I think you can really put this in perspective. This is APD's version of an EIS system, an early intervention system, which many departments have developed. Some of them have up to 20 evaluation criteria. They've decided on 7, and they're trying to rework and trying to figure out what the trigger points are at this point. But this is really a fancy name for an EIS system. And in your IA report, there's an EIS alert that's listed every month. That's essentially what this is replacing.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything?
Knowing that it's a pilot program, getting a little background on it, I think suits most of my concerns. My only major concern really was how much time per employee this would require of a supervisor when you look at the daily monitoring, documenting, plans, coaching. But seeing that it's a pilot program, I mean, it seems like that's something they have to sort of try to figure out, what sort of burden that really places, if it's any at all, and it may not be significant. So I'm happy to support it in that form.
if I could respond to that, I think that it's sort of software intensive, and so once they get the software model developed and implemented, then you can presumably walk up to your desk in the morning and sort of click on the menu and look at what the status of your department is. Now, I think that's obviously an oversimplification, and I think it's my main concern about this program is how predictive it will be in terms of, and how sensitive it will be to changes in employee behavior. And I don't think it'll be particularly sensitive, and probably shouldn't be actually. But I think the idea is that it gives a snapshot, or it gives a quick look at, are things going off track? And so presumably, once they learn how to develop the software, then it shouldn't take a lot of time, I think, by to implement, or when it's implemented. So
Do you have anything, Board Member Armijo Pruitt? Do you have anything, Board Member St. John? Okay. Would you guys like to give this an endorsement? Okay.
I move we endorse it. I move we endorse the program as, and with the usual boilerplate,
Okay.
so.
Second. Any other discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Great.
Okay, the next one is 210. I attended the PPRB for this meeting. It was really, I will confess, for me, it was really insider baseball. It pertains to the use of dispatch and how officers log calls, sign off of calls, et cetera. There was a really healthy discussion of the policy in that meeting, and there were changes made to the policy in that meeting. Dispatch was there, in attendance so that there was, an expert. But I don't personally have any recommended changes to this policy. And I don't know if anyone else has any comments or not. Do you, Dr. Cass?
No, well, I've been to this briefing on a couple different times, and was it Erica Wilson who presented it? And I have high regard for her expertise, and I believe she's also primarily responsible for this policy, the rewrite, if not the original. Is that right? So I think she's very competent, and I think it probably got a good vetting at PPRB. So.
Yeah, I would concur in that. So we can, with that, we can either endorse it or do a non-substantive comment. Which would you guys like?
I move we endorse it.
Okay, I'll second your motion.
Any other discussion? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great.
Okay. The next three are all related to each other. And unfortunately, I was having technical difficulties which caused me to be unaware that this PPRB was occurring until the day after it occurred. So I don't really have recommendations on any of these policies specifically, but they are 135 crime scene specialist, 1-41 evidence unit, and 1-57 scientific evidence division. Maybe, I don't know if, Director Harness was probably there. Were you at that one? No?
Chair Galloway and Member Van Deventer, I was not. I was in Force Review Board training that day.
Okay. Okay, well, I read them and I didn't have anything to add. Did anyone have anything to add or discuss on these policies?
I have nothing to add. I don't think it's a sin not to make a recommendation. So we don't have to make a recommendation, and especially if there's no flags or they haven't risen to the level of being above the horizon, sort of. So.
Yeah, I think it's perfectly acceptable for these policies to make just the usual reply that we've received them and have no substantive responses at this time. So
Agreed.
I would make that motion for all three of these policies.
I'll second.
Any other discussion? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Great.
Okay, excellent. So I will get this stuff done, and next meeting, I will place these things at the front of the policy agenda. That way, we don't run out of time before we get these recommendations compiled. That way, the text gets in front of the board. I
Sounds
won't make that mistake again, or I will try my hardest not to make that mistake again. Okay.
Okay, moving along on our agenda, item 10, we have tabled until next month. Item 11, serious use of force, officer-involved shooting cases, there are none. CPOA, item 12, CPOA Board's review of Garrity materials, there are none pending. Is there any other business? All right, then with that, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
I so move.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you, everybody.